let's add a user. Let's add user Bob. So just really going to run add user Bob. Well, actually, you have user add and add user on most systems. User add, create or update a new user. You know, it's like we can specify the login, the base directory. We can add a comment, home directory. You know, remember man pages? Read the man pages. It's totally fine. Allow the creation of a user account with a duplicate non-unique UID. That sounds dangerous. Man user add user. User add, create a new. Okay, so add user on this system is just an alias and it takes the same options. Let's check Debian. Now on Debian, add user, add group, add a user or group to the system is a different command that takes different parameters. So what's the difference? What's going on here? It's like, well, technically user add is the binary that's actually doing the work here. But add user on some systems is a script that will use the user add binary and it's thought to be more user friendly for adding a system. There's not really a difference in functionality between the two. So there you go. In general, I would recommend add user and del user, DEL user, when adding a system, just because it is, I think it's more user friendly, but not every system is going to provide it. Depending on the version and what year it is and that kind of thing. So to make things even more confusing, well, not really confusing, but just something to keep in mind, user add just adds the user entry to shadow and password. But as we saw, there's a home directory component, like /home/Wendell. And if you remember when we first set up these systems, there was a lot of stuff in here. Was that part of the installer, or was that, what was going on there with the first system that was added? Well, and etc., there's this folder called Skell. And Skell is a skeleton home directory. Now you can change what directory the system uses as a skeleton home directory. But whenever a new user is created, it'll start by default with this bash logout file, this bash rc, and this profile. So every time you add a new user, it'll copy /etc/skell to that directory. There's also some options in there, like changing things like the umask, which is the default permissions when you create a file. Like as a user, if I create a file, is that file read and writable only by me? What about my group? If I'm a user as a member of a group with other users and I create a file and I want that file to be readable and writable by other people in my group by default, how do you control that? Well, the answer is something called umask, and you can set your umask preferences inside these files that are created on your account, or if your account already exists, you can go modify those files and change the umask line, which you can use grep to find that. I don't have to hold your hand for this anymore, right? Because that's the thing. But the umask controls the user, group, and world permissions on files that are created by a particular user, at least going forward. It's not going to retroactively change your other files, and you can still change it after the fact. It's like, I'm going to create my super secret shopping list, and by default the umask is going to let my group read it, but after I save my shopping list, I'm going to go back and take away their ability to read or write my shopping list. You can totally do that, and that's completely fine. And actually, there's something that we'll talk about in the advanced course called file system ACLs, because maybe owner, group, and world permissions is not sophisticated enough. Maybe I want to create a folder, and in that folder, any file created in that folder will by default be readable and writable by both me and the group. Maybe I want to have another folder that belongs to me, and even though my default group and my umask is set so that my group would be able to read and write files that I create, for a particular folder, I can set extended attributes so that that folder does not permit the group to read or write anything, even by default. So, file system ACLs, you can do some really, really advanced, complicated stuff in terms of permissions. But that's a little beyond what we need to get into. You just need to know that exists. So back to user add versus add user. Which one is more correct? User add is the thing that is actually adding the user to the system, but it's not going to do helpful things like copy your SKEL folder and do other, like, quote unquote, do it the right way is sort of what you see sometimes. And so add user is going to do all those nice things for you. The GUI in GNOME and KDE will do all those nice things for you to sort of make your life easier, I guess. It's nice to be able to verify that things are working as you expect at the command line, but that's what's happening under the hood. So let's use add user. Bob. Now we see that add user Bob on Red Hat has basically just done, it added the user. And so if we do ls/home, we see that we've got a Bob folder, which is good. Got to become root so I can poke around because, you know, Wendell doesn't have permission to see in Bob's folder. And we can see that I've got, you know, bash profile, logout, bash rc, Mozilla. And if we look at ls/etc/skell, we can see, oh, my skeleton directory on Red Hat does contain Mozilla and bash logout profile, etc. And these files are exactly the same size with exactly the same date. So we can be assured that, you know, add user in this case copied all that stuff and did that. So we're going to do add user here, Bob. Now something different's happening. It's asking for a Unix password. Full name, room number, work phone, home phone, other system information correct, sure. And so if we less, etc/password, we can see that we've got Bob. There's some commas here. That's because that's the comment field. This is a comment field, and so, you know, the whole room number, work number, all that stuff is just comma separated values. It's not really anything special. It's just text. That's all it is. We can see that the user ID on the system is 1001. We jumped from 117 Debian GDM. That sounds like something the system added to, you know, 1000, 1001. That's just by convention. There's nothing special with that. If we come back here, we less, etc. password, we can see that, you know, the same thing is going on here. We've got that. So see that my account's up here, and then we've got all this other stuff. What happened there? Well, if you remember when we set up Red Hat, a lot of stuff wasn't here. We didn't even have a GUI. So this is still in like chronological order that they were added, not in UID order. And that's just how Red Hat manages things. But so we added, you know, GeoClue, RKit, you know, none of this stuff is making any sense. We haven't covered this. GDM, we covered GDM. Oh, that's the GNOME Display Manager. Okay. And then, you know, QEMU, we added that for virtualization, and then GNOME initial setup X. Okay, so toward the end. So these are all the other accounts the system needs to run services to be able to surface a graphical user environment. Whereas Debian and KDE, you know, you had a graphical environment by default. Red Hat, you don't, because, well, at least on the version of Red Hat that I installed, because it's more aimed for servers. Red Hat Enterprise Linux. I mean, it's like we don't need a GUI. We just want the command line. The GUI is just bloat. It's going to be all these services that we don't need running, or all these, you know, users that we don't need on the system. It makes sense. It makes sense why that is. So we've got, you know, me when I added the system, when we did the initial installation, and now we've got Bob. Now I didn't set a password on Bob. So you can't log in? Doesn't seem like you can log in. Let's try, you know, let's try switching users. See if this works. Wait, Bob's not listed. No password? Nope. Sorry, that didn't work. Try again. So how do we reset Bob's password? So passwd Bob, just like the file passwd Bob. Passwd doesn't contain the passwords, but you use passwd to set the passwords, because passwd used to contain the passwords, but it it was determined that that was not secure because then people could read the password hashes of other users. So the password hashes are stored in a file that no one has access to now. It kind of makes sense. So now we've reset Bob's password. Should be able to do stuff as Bob. Notice that it immediately asked me for a new password and to retype the password. Now if I'm Wendell, like only root can specify a username. Okay, if I just do passwd, I can change my own password, but it makes me enter my current password. I can't just change my password without knowing it, which again, it's a nice security feature. And if you think about how it works on Windows with Active Directory, basically works the same way. Now, is it possible to log into a system and not have a password? Yes, that is where keys come in, like the SSH keys for remote access. But we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Now, we talked about adding users, and we talked a little bit about groups, but, you know, when I've used the word groups, it's really just, you know, the normal English meaning, a group of things. But in Linux, there's groups of users. And so how do you manage that, or how is that managed, or, you know, what's the deal with that? Well, like password and shadow, there's a groups file in etc. So I'm just in the etc folder here, and I can less groups. Well, group. And so here we see it's like root, bin, daemon, sys, adm, tty, disk, lp, lp's line printer, mem, kmem, wheel. It's like Wendell's a member of that. Mail, postfix is a member of that. That's what that means. That's what this formatting is, where it's, you know, this is the group name, this is the group ID, and this is the users that belong to it. So in case you're wondering, there's just one there. And then Wendell has a group because we added a user. Users get their own groups. On most systems, when you add a user, it also adds a group named the same as the user. That's not a requirement, though. That's just a convention. You could totally not have a group the same as the user when you add a user. If you want to, you could add them to an existing group. And a lot of these are special groups. So like KVM, there's a KVM group, and QEMU, the QEMU user, remember this is for virtualization, is a member of that group. This is one way that permissions are managed on the system, is groups of users. And it's easy to refer to a group of users like this group of users has permission to print. This group of users has permission to run virtual machines. This group of users has permission to do whatever, rather than specify individual users. And so it's easy to imagine, it's like, well, root has their group. Why isn't Wendell a member of the group? It's like, well, there's wheel. And so wheel is kind of an administrative type group that you see on many systems. Let's take a look at Debian and see if it's the same way. Now in Debian, we can see that things have started to diverge. There's not really a wheel group in the group file on Debian, but we can see that there are several groups, CD-ROM, floppy, audio, dip, to which the Wendell user belongs. So for audio, Pulse is there. I'll give you a hint. Pulse Audio is the name of the audio system on Linux, or one of the several, because, you know, you've got a lot of choice on Linux. There's also the sudo group, and there's no member in there. Don't read too much into that. That's not really a thing. Haven't even installed sudo by default on Debian. Sudo is the command that will let you run a command as another user. So like on Red Hat, by default, the root user is disabled, but you can have an administrative user that is a member of the wheel group that can run commands using sudo. Like, do this command as root is how you should read sudo, or sudo. Sudo is the English word, but super user do is what that means on the Red Hat side of the world. Well, su is installed on both Red Hat and Debian, but sudo, or sudo, is not installed by default on Debian. Yes, you can install it with apt. You know, we can apt install sudo, and we don't get that, but we do apt install, and so if we do sudo, you know, it doesn't work on Debian, but you can install it. And so when you install it, I can type vi sudo, and this is a file that controls who is allowed to do what as root. So it's a little bit more fine-grained permissions. And so this is taking us into our editor, and we've got another file in etc. called sudo sudoers. And so these are the people that are allowed to sudo, basically. And so we can see that root is allowed to do whatever and allow members of group sudo to execute any command. And so on Debian, we can see that you can see on Red Hat, this is really, similar. There's a lot of, well, Red Hat's is a lot more complicated because Red Hat does more stuff with PAM, and so here's some more defaults, and it's like, okay, here's the part that we're interested in. Allow root to run any commands anywhere, and then we can see that that's the same kind of thing on the Debian system. Allow root, and then %sudo, allow members of group sudo to execute any command. And so this is wheel, same thing without a password. Now this is commented out in this, oh, there it is, right there. I was like, oh, what's going on? Oh, okay, they don't have to re-enter their password. So this file, and we'll get into editing this and managing this and doing the more complicated stuff with sudoers in part 2 of the course. But you should be aware of this, because this file controls what normal users are allowed to escalate permissions to root using their password. If they have the root password, then they can still do that. But if you want to give somebody administrative privileges with their own password, then you can control it a little bit with this. And so on the Red Hat system, it's members of the wheel group, and on Debian, it's members of the sudo group, if and only if sudo is installed. If sudo is not installed, so if we go back to our Debian system and pretend that I did not just install sudo, well, how does it work? It was like, well, you just have a root password. So on Red Hat, you can have no root password at all, and the only way to do root things is as a regular user, which is a better situation in terms of accountability. Think about it in terms of, like, you've got a system and a business, and you've got 3 or 4 people that use the system. It's like, how do you know who ran the command if there is a root password and the root password is shared among users? It's not an ideal situation. That is philosophically why Red Hat does the things the way that it does, and that is why there is a difference in the way that Red Hat does that with Debian. Now, on the OpenSUSE side of things, it's a little bit different story.